Hi, I'm Joshua Lim, and I'm a student of political science. Hello, good morning. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Karis. I'm a human rights advocate and a legislative lobbyist.
Hello, good morning. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Alyssa Mia, and professionally I am a sociology lecturer, and I'm also an activist for human rights.
Hi, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Joshua Chu. I'm a human rights and LGBTQ activist.
What do you understand about the death penalty or the mandatory death penalty?
What I understand regarding the subject is that the death penalty, also known as capital punishment, is the execution of an offender of the law to be sentenced to death after being convicted by a court of law.
The death penalty represents the final punishment to one's life for when they have crossed the threshold to where things could never be amended or forgiven, may it be the harm that they have caused upon others, the state, or themselves.
The death penalty has since been abolished in many nations, but there are still a few nations that continue to support it. More will carry out the mandatory death penalty, and these are countries very familiar to us, including the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and even our neighboring country, Singapore.
There are various types of executions which include hanging, shooting, electrocution, lethal injection, and more, according to the Penal Form International. However, while these methods are used in some other countries that carry the death penalty, the most common method used is lethal injection.
In Malaysia, the country holds upon a motto where it comes to the death penalty, with it being gantung sampai mati, which translates to hang till death. The inmate is given a 24-hour notice prior to when they are hanged till their last breath, and in the meantime, they are allowed visits from their family and to make their request for their last meal.
Malaysians have realized that the mandatory death penalty meant for drug trafficking is wrong because the majority of people who are convicted of this penalty most of the time are mules, whom are people that were tricked or threatened or are financially disadvantaged. For example, a graduate from a poor Malay family of rice farmers by the name of Umi Azlim Muhammad Nazim was admitted to having 2.9 kilos of heroin found in her luggage when she was arrested at the airport. The 24-year-old graduate now faces the death penalty in China.
The problem with the mandatory death penalty, especially from the drug offense perspective, is the subjectivity of these cases, which the judicial system has close to no regard for. And I'm talking about real people who end up being drug mules or are manipulated into transporting cases of substances. And these people are often going through all sorts of financial battles, incomprehensible to our regular society, those of us who live comfortably. So to them, they think that this would be a quick and easy method of getting the means that they need to support them financially, just a one-time thing. But the heavy reliance on criminal laws, repressive policies, and other measures based on prohibition has resulted in a widespread of human rights violations.
Another important example on how some drug dealers are really victims of the systematic and economic failure is the case of Harun Jamal, a single mother with 9 children who was discovered to be trafficking shabu and was given the death penalty. She's a fishmonger from Sabah, the most impoverished region in Malaysia, and was also a single mother trying to provide for 9 kids. Her story serves as an illustration of how the death sentence in Malaysia punishes the poor in particular by discriminating against women. So 95% of the women in Malaysia reported to be serving a death sentence in 2019 were found guilty of drug-related offences. So there's little to no possibility for women who have experienced assault, abuse, or exploitation to have these circumstances taken into account while sentencing. So regarding the case, but also how poverty contributes to drug use and trafficking is the underlying socio-economic causes of drug use and sales, such as poor health, denied education, unemployment, housing shortages, poverty, and prejudice. which have not been addressed by the current drug policy. So there are a lot of circumstances that various drug users and dealers struggle with, which makes it very hard for them to raise money to support themselves and their family. So it just pushes them to go to the criminal world as an alternative.
There has been many cases and reports that have been filed with a presumably number of reasons that make a trial not in favor of the defendant. For example, to when it was common for defendants who could not afford a lawyer to go without any legal assistance until charges were brought before a court, for when it was common for defendants to get beaten up to extract confessions, for when it was common to have a very high rate of foreigners sentenced to death, as well as the numerous languages spoken inside the country. But Malaysian law does not provide any interpretation services to support defendants who do not speak Malay other than in the courtroom proceedings, which leads to already abused defendants blindly agreeing to sign any paper in front of them without any prior understanding to what they could have just signed off. Well, in this context, it would be their life. An example of this would be the case of Hu Yuhua, a Malaysian of Chinese ethnicity who was arrested at age 20 in 2005 with meth and convicted based on a statement he made in Mandarin, his mother tongue, but which the police later recorded in Malay. He says that the statement that they made him sign is inaccurate and that the police broke his finger during the interrogation and further threatened to beat his girlfriend if he refused to sign it. He did not have the assistance of a lawyer during this period, and Hu Yuhua has been on death row since 2011.
Another issue that was discovered is that out of the 713 Malaysian nationals on death row, 48% belong to the Malay ethnic group, 24% to the Chinese group, 25% to the Indian group, and 4% to the other ethnic groups. But these people who belong to the Indian group as well as other ethnic minorities are being overrepresented on death row, whilst the Malay ethnicity has a low proportion compared to its national comparative.
Next question, would you explain what brought about the discussion?
Nagantran.
Nagantran.
The hashtag Save Nagantran.
The case of Nagantran, a modern-day prime example of how no matter how much a country seeks and claims to protect its people and its nation, they are yet to be the one to be sitting around with their hands in their pocket and not to be seen when there are those who truly, truly need their help. Nagantran was a young boy who not only was a victim to the system by first being born as a minority, second being born to a family of poverty, and third, being born having mentally and intellectual disabilities. He had mentioned prior in his statements that he was not only was he coerced, but he was further than risking the lives of his loved ones as they needed him to smuggle 42 grams of heroin from Malaysia to Singapore.
Nagantran was then sentenced to death by hanging in November 2010, but was put on hold due to a moratorium placed on all hangings in Singapore, pending judicial changes of the mandatory death penalty laws. Laws which were considered and approved the imposition of life imprisonment with or without caning for drug traffickers who were either drug mules or suffering from mental illness. But despite his numerous appeals, he was deemed ineligible for resentencing because he wasn't found to be neither mentally nor intellectually disabled, which had been also further confirmed by the psychiatrist called upon by his lawyers.
So his case became the highlight on social media after a letter sent to his mother about his death sentence date was publicized. So his case spread internationally, and many alongside Nagantran's mother, Panchalai, pleaded Singapore to not continue on with the death sentence. However, in 2019, Malaysian human rights lawyer Anne Surendran criticized Singapore for unfairly giving a mentally man a death sentence, and Nagantran's new attorney, M. Ravi, contended that Nagantran did not receive a fair trial because the psychiatric evidence presented by his previous defense was allegedly not fully taken into account in comparison to the reports of the prosecution's psychiatrist.
And what made the case especially relevant was how this Ipoh-born Malaysian had human rights activists from all over urging the government to halt the execution, with of course the argument that he had an impaired executive functioning and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which should account as an intellectual disability, which by right should have made him eligible for resentencing. Unfortunately, despite his many appeals, he was found not substantially mentally nor intellectually disabled, as they concurred he was fully aware of what he got himself into, given that he confessed. However, an additional statement made by Nagendran himself, claiming that he was threatened and coerced into trafficking in fear for his loved ones, was ignored. In 2022, an online petition to save Nagendran gathered nearly 40,000 signatures as a public cry to Singapore's government, and that too was ignored. Then came April 27th, 2022, and Nagendran was executed. So while the hashtag Save Nagendran case was still blowing up all over social media, activists and organizations like Wake Up Singapore on Instagram and other organizations such as Bangun.my, which is what I'm part of, and other local Instagram organizations took liberty upon bringing up more cases similar to that of Nagendran's. And these are similar stories, same coercions into trafficking, but also received the same dismissal of the public cries. In fact, this July itself, another Malaysian named Kalwan Singh was executed for trafficking in Singapore, and he was executed on the 7th of July. The subjectivity of his case was hardly looked at because socioeconomic factors or poverty is not recognized in the eyes of the judiciary system, and wrong is wrong. There is no such thing as empathy towards these cases, because if you give face to one case, that will mean we would have to relook into all the other cases, and that's just too much to go on about. And we're supposed to sit back and say, hey, this is how it is, this is how the law works. So yeah, Malaysia wanting to take that step to get their hands dirty and to look into these cases again and rediscuss the basis on the mandatory death penalty is a pretty big deal.
After researching further regarding the topic, was that the death penalty should not be mandatory, because many individuals who are convicted are either in financial trouble, have been threatened by the individuals, or are mentally unstable, thus are easily manipulated. These people should not be reprimanded with such a penalty for being manipulated, and should be given the right to go to court and plead for their case, not to be ignored and given the penalty without any afterthought.
Besides that, in my humble opinion, should any government take the death penalty as something to be really of practice, they should first ensure that there are least to none flaws in the system, and ensure that every man, woman, and third gender being to really have a fair fight in their pleas of claims of innocence. As if we were to easily punish any who we all deem to be as punishable and execute them, right? Then aren't we no different from murderers who had just made the choice of killing their victim for any particular of a reason? Are we really allowed to play God?
A lot of people end up in the same situation, but there are different motives onto how they end up in the situation. So some might do it voluntarily for the thrill of it, but some chose to do it because they assumed it was the only way for them to get the money they need. However, there are some cases where people would be coerced into doing a certain crime, but then should everyone suffer the same consequences as the others?
Could you shed light on what Malaysia has proposed?
So on June 10, 2022, Datuk Seri Dr. Wan Junaidi Tuanku Jaafar stated that the government has agreed to abolish the mandatory death penalty, which was followed by the presentation of a report by the Special Committee to review alternative sentences to the mandatory death penalty. However, it was clarified by Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob that the death penalty would remain and no longer be mandatory. However, Dr. Umar Junaidi confirmed that the Cabinet had consented to further investigation and analysis of the suggested substitute sentences for 11 mandatory death penalty offences. One offence under Section 39B of the Dangerous Drugs Act 1952, and the other 22 offences that carry the possibility of the death penalty at the judge's discretion. So in other words, this analysis would allow judges to decide how certain circumstances can justify a crime and possibly reduce sentences for 11 crimes instead of the required death sentence. So the Malaysian government is encouraged to propose the revised legislation as soon as possible and reduce all death sentences to alternative penalties.
Experts also further encourage the Malaysian government to quickly submit the revising of the legislation and commute all death sentences to other punishments, after noting that no draft legislation has yet been made public. At the moment, there are 11 offences which the mandatory death penalty deals with, which majority are of the drug-related offences. The decision made by the Cabinet will then provide the judges to pass the sentence at their own discretion. But these amendments will require the Parliament to pass before they are taken into effect.
Honestly, I feel that as a nation, we are already quite progressive, being lenient with the death penalty, being understanding towards how death really isn't the answer. And I honestly think after the case of Nagentran, with how everyone could witness the uproar of us Malaysians, our government too decided to, mend the rules and abolish the mandatory death penalty, not only for drug-related cases, but also for all of the 11 crimes in it as well. And despite it not being passed yet, this is still a very big step for our nation, as not only is this a progressive step that reflects the world's trend, as from it not being approved to be abolished in the year of 2019 to it now, 2 years later, only 2 years, the practice of mandatory capital punishment is now being abolished.
Currently, the majority of Malaysians are welcoming the government's intention to revise the application of the mandatory death penalty, and even experts from UN are saying that this measure, if passed into law, will further bolster the global trend towards universal abolition and even contribute to the enhancement and development of human rights. So all this somewhat makes sense now as to why this discussion continues to circulate every now and then in Malaysia now, doesn't it? Malaysia wants to be one of the firsts. And while this is a big step in reforming, we all must do our due diligence to see this through, on the note that no draft legislation has been released so far. Introducing the amending legislations without further delay could determine the fates of more than 1,300 convicts currently held on death row, many of whom actually belong to ethnic minorities.
Really, start reading, start educating yourself, start educating others. It's time, it's really time to stop as a nation, that we all, stop being ignorant towards battles that we presume will not affect us at all, as it is through these battles in where as a nation we get to grow and make little progressive changes in which amounts to a big change that we all speak and dream of but never truly fight for. Despite death and crimes being such a subject of taboo, right? We should not be afraid to discuss this at dinners, gatherings, or any random old conversations, as you would never know to when if you really help change one's perspective and broaden their views on the whys and hows to the abolishment of the death penalty. It's time for not only the laws and the policies to be reformed, but also for our societal values to be reformed as well. We might have come from a time in where it makes sense to use death as the ultimate punishment to many of the heinous crimes that have been committed, but through this change of times, we should also now understand that there are many other ways in where death shouldn't be the first solution at hand, as this does not address the main core of the issue at hand at all, and this becomes a clutch for those in power to use and abuse, as it then becomes an easy way out for the government to cut out the weeds by using the law.
I guess just continue to be aware of what is really going on in Malaysia and keep in mind the information about it. So a lot of people has chosen to be ignorant about certain issues that are happening in Malaysia. And with the, we can't do anything about it anyway mindset, it can be one of the factors that can draw the country back from moving forward, especially with the current generation who's speaking up for a lot of things that need changes. So wherever you are, even on social media especially, just voice out and push a certain issue into light until it has no choice but to be resolved. So there might be instances where we don't want it to go the way we intended to, but resilience is just what we need. So don't let it be a stumbling block that is standing in our way, but just use some of our energy to fight for what is needed in Malaysia. And just encourage your friends to do so. Share with them what is happening, the surface issues, and especially the deeper issues. Sometimes it's just best for them to hear it from someone your own age. Especially with the abolishment of the mandatory death penalty, they may not know what is going on or how it especially affects them, but as us being the future of Malaysia, I feel like all of us should know what is happening in the country we're living in and continue to affect people with awareness and the right attitude.
Stay informed. Read only reliable sources, and even if you want to get your chunk of news from social media, make sure their sources are credible. Second, educate yourself, even if it's just a little bit, on the existing laws or even the articles within our constitution, because you can't follow suit into a movement blindly without understanding the way the system works, the way laws are passed, or even human rights that are both recognized internationally and domestically. Lastly, do not engage in the spreading of false information. This is an obvious one, but this ties both of my first points together, because once somebody misunderstands the system, they begin drawing their own conclusions, which aren't at all credible nor reliable, and it will result in a social media widespread, because social media is fast, okay? And a great example of this was something that happened early this year when the Malaysian government in 2022 released the statement that they will be looking over the bill proposed years ago to abolish the mandatory death penalty, and this came along with their plans. And many people, youngsters, took to social media to share the official government document while adding captions like, "The government has abolished the death penalty." And sentences like this alone messes with the facts. Has isn't even the tense we're looking at now, as the law has not been published and is still in discussion, in fact, for the alternative 11 offences due for the mandatory death penalty. Other than that, this entire statement, "has abolished the death penalty," leaves out the word mandatory, which is the discussion being tabled. And yeah, while there shouldn't be any harm or foul in expressing their excitement or joy on social media towards this entire motion, it is after all the age of social media, but the possibility of this being one of those swept under the rug discussions is odds on, and we don't want that. So we should all see this through and inform ourselves of the ongoing discourse, not just for the mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking offences, but including all 11 alternative punishments in discussion. And we ourselves should continue to have the conversation with friends, with family, and just keep it going until the laws are published.
Basically just keep up to date on all the things going on in Malaysia, as well as stay informed of matters that may not only affect your livelihood but also the livelihood of others. There are many ways one may be ignorant regarding the events happening around one's life, but make it a habit to keep yourself informed as well as educated on topics that may very well aid you in the future or someone you may care for very deeply. Your actions may very well help someone who has been mistreated or help get yourself out of a very bad situation. Many of our current generation of Malaysians choose to be ignorant of certain issues that very well may be happening to people who do not deserve to be treated as such. So please, be the change that Malaysia is in very much need right now. Educate yourself as much as possible to at the very least understand the gist of the things happening around you and in your daily lives. I believe that we as Malaysians should be at the very least aware of what is happening in our beloved country and spread this awareness amongst others as well. Thank you.